Always reading hot rod magazines, style stuff, and I was very attracted to the T-Bucket. Also a fairly easy car to build. I had a hot rod in my earlier years, and getting out of the service, I said I'm gonna build one. Okay, so looking at all magazines and everything else, orange was on my list from the beginning. I have a good art eye, scale, mechanically able, and I ordered a chassis from California, which just was a perimeter chassis. One of my friends blew up his Corvette. I wound up with that engine, rebuilt it, and spent every day, night, spare time, making an extreme effort on the car. The quality was always number one. My father was an engineer, and he showed me how to do things correctly. Spent about 8 months building the car because I spent so much time on it. Into the 70s, it was finished in 71. In 73, we got a great idea to drive it to California. A good mechanic friend of mine. We did the trip, it was great. California wasn't what I thought it was gonna be. Very spread out, and it's hard to fit in when you're not from that area. We only spent a couple of months out there, drove the car back. It was a very harsh ride. It had a straight axle, 55 Chevy rear end in it at that point. When I got home, I said there's a better way. And we started building an independent suspension using a Corvette center section. But the control arms and the struts are all my geometry where the tires stay parallel to each other throughout the travel, unlike a Corvette. Parallel, equal length control arms in the back and custom control arms on the side. And this car was always a progression. It started with a simple 4-barrel, 425 horse motor, which is a lot for any T-Bucket. Then the progression was a low-rise, dual quad manifold. A couple of years later, the tunnel ram with the same carburetors raised up. Changes for the better on the car, not radical. But I almost drove it daily when it was fair weather. We had some great hot rod shows in the New York Coliseum. When it was done, I was so anxious to drive it all the time. I had other great cars at the same time. I had a 435 67 Corvette Coupe, 57 Thunderbird, but the T is an expression of what I could do. And there's so many variations of a T-Bucket. Getting back to the Corvette rear end, the funny cars were big, early 70s, and I could never find the right tire for the car in perspective that I thought. So I started with the biggest set of tires we could find, some Halbrand wheels, and built the rear end to fit the tires. Gave it a great soft ride, tremendous acceleration. Living in an apartment with my wife, wondering where the house was going to come from, I decided to sell the Corvette and the Sunkist T-Bucket, put the cash into a house. The car always remained in the area. Nobody really used it. When you don't build a car yourself, you really don't have soul in the car. There's a big difference between a builder and a buyer at that point. You can't appreciate the car unless you built it. You don't know the car unless you built it, and down the line. It's terrific. It couldn't be any better for me. I showed him the car. I could have bought it back maybe 15 years ago. I showed him the car. He was only 15, and it didn't really flick the switch. He wasn't overly impressed. The car was a little deteriorated from not being taken care of. Some time went on. Someone else bought it, semi-restored it, and he didn't use it much either. And as I said before, your soul isn't into the car unless you have your hands on in the build, the figuring, what's this, what's that, what do you want here. One thing on this car, the wire wheels were absolutely necessary on the front. There were no great wheel choices for a T-Bucket. These had just come out from Hallcraft, and They were advertised for dune buggies and off-road vehicles. I bought them anyway, and the big block with steel heads was very heavy. I said, well, we'll try it. When we got to California, I visited the Hallcraft factory. They only had rated these for 1,200 pounds. When they saw what I had done with the wheels, cross country, etc., they increased the rating and started advertising them more for the T-bucket because of my trip. We had hit an open pothole and bent one of the rims. That triggered the trip to Hallcraft in El Cajon. And when they saw it, and the car ran fine with a bent rim because the tire stays round, it's got a tube in it. They accommodated me, gave me a new wheel, no charge, and we went on our happy way. Other things on the car, the body is mounted a little differently than any other T-bucket. It's higher in the back, it's not level with the frame. It gives about 3 more inches of seating room in the car. And it accommodates the chop top affair that I have. Originally, the car was built with no top and a tall T windshield that folds in half. It looked kind of silly. I used to drive it with the windshield folded down. That looked silly. Just took off the top pane and built the roof out of conduit, electrical conduit, and there was a great upholsterer around here at the time. Whipped me up a great top. The interior I had done myself, the painting myself. Most of the stuff on the car I did myself except for engine machine work and chrome plating. But engine assembly I always do myself, and final assembly with all the correct hardware. It's a very important part of the cars I build. The hardware is, I would say, 50% of the attraction of the car. If the hardware is scrambled, it really doesn't add to the car. When it's specialty hardware, all my hardware on the cars are aircraft hardware. Not only for safety, but they're beautiful. Yeah, at the time I was building the car, I had been working for Cliffside Body Corporation. When I got out of the Army, that was my first job I took, and I was taught to weld and build moving vans and custom trucks, sunroofs, and it was a specialty bodybuilding corporation based around trucks. But I learned a lot. I was a very good painter. They had me doing the fire engines and specialty vehicles. At the time there was a guy pinstriping for the moving vans and the gold leaf lettering and everything else, and he goes, "Why don't you let me stripe that?" I said, "Fine." And it was a no-charge situation. He just walked up to it and went around the car in 20 minutes. You know, you should put a name on this. A lot of cars back in the old days had names. And he goes, I probably had an orange with Sunkist on it, and he probably related to that. And he put the name Sunkist on it. What do you think? I said, that's great. And the name went with the car all the time. It wasn't just the orange T-bucket, it was the Sunkist. After this work at the Body Corporation, I met a fellow, Willie, who fell in love with this car, and we started a business, custom body shop and painting, custom painting. And he said, I have to have one of those cars. It's got to be the same, whatever. So at night we started working on another one, and it was to have most of the same specifications. When it came time for color, he always liked black. It was black, and we called it Moonkissed. So there was a Sunkist and Moonkissed T-buckets that were totally outrageous at the time. When this was done in the early 70s, it was a showstopper for detail, cleanliness, and engineering. We always got best engine, best engineering, best paint. And when we started going to these hot rod things, it wasn't several thousand cars. It was 200 or 300 cars back in the 70s. So we were up there in the number 1 and 2 list all the time. Couldn't feel any better when my son bought the car back. We were sitting in the front yard, The current owner had pulled up with the car and Randy was all over it, and he took off. The next day he told me, came in the driveway with a big smile on his face that I've never seen before. He was glowing, and I said, "What's up, Rand? What is up?" I bought the Sunkist. At first I didn't believe it. He was saving money for a house. Why would you do that? Blah, blah. We don't want anybody else to have the car. I appreciate it now. And we took it. It had a couple of silly mechanical stuff done wrong by other people. So we went through it, brought it back a little, changed a few items, cleaned it up, and here we are. When he got the car, he was a little worried that he wouldn't know how to handle it, or this car in the wrong hands could be very dangerous. It's amazing that we put about 50,000 miles on this car from the time it was built throughout the years. And as I said before, nobody had really taken the time to enjoy it, drive it, back to the owner-builder situation again. Randy drives it very well. He's not afraid of it, and he's in total control. I think it was a major part of his life that he's got his dad's car. We use it together. All those years, we always developed an interest, a similar interest in cars, to where he's developed an eye probably better than me for all the stickler details. You see cars with a piece of thin aluminum on the firewall, not really attractive. When it came time for the firewall, there was a small junkyard around by my house where I grew up, and stopped over there and I said, "I need a piece of aluminum. I'm making this for a firewall." He said, "I have a piece of polished aircraft aluminum." And it was about just enough to do the firewall. And it was a $15 purchase back then. It had been covered with protective tape. When you see the thickness on this, you know you're looking at somebody's taking a lot of time to cut it, fit it, etc. The carriage bolts on the firewall, I noticed on a lot of vehicles, as I said before, going through the hot rod magazines and all this other stuff. These are actually Volkswagen bumper bolts. They're not just carriage bolts. They come chrome. They're the right size. It's hard to polish, but it's optically correct. It doesn't have waves in it because it's an aircraft piece of aluminum. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You can't give a guy a piece of aluminum and say polish it because it comes back like the funhouse. When I started building the car, I probably didn't know what I was going to use for a motor. Most of these were small block, Chevy powered, except for the stuff that was built in the 50s with all the vintage engines. As I said before, I grew up with big block Corvettes all my life. Almost all my friends had them. And one fella blew his up. He said, "That's it, I'm selling the car, do you want the motor?" Sure. That was probably a $200 purchase. Setting the body on the chassis, move it around 20 times. Setting the motor in a chassis, up and down, forward and back. It takes a lot of time. You just don't do it to do it. You gotta look at it. I had a very good eye. In junior college, I took art classes, but I was always drawing with my father. As I said before, he was an Army engineer. He'd help me with my homework, always a straight rule and a square, and I just picked it up. I had mechanical drawing in high school, which was a great aid. How do you get through this? How do you fabricate? If you can't make straight lines and know how to put the numbers down, you're probably lost. It's not easy, but if you're good at it, it becomes easier. And everything, follows suit. So the engine had a bad crankshaft and a connecting rod. Took it all apart, put it on a stand, see what it needed, brought it to my favorite machine shop, and built it as a standard 425 horse, 427, 1966 Corvette engine. I was very familiar with it, and you know that it's going to operate correctly. Overpowered, definitely, but manageable in the right hands. And as I said before, it started with a simple 4-barrel, easy to get running, then 2.4s, then a tonal ring with 2.4s. The magneto is something that when I look into good hot rod magazines, it seems like every good serious car had a magneto in it. So I bought a magneto back then for it. It's a very attractive piece, and it kind of follows suit with the car. My father was instrumental too. I was building the car, still living at home. One day he came home with a pair of Model T headlights, because in the early 70s, this stuff was still common and laying around. And he goes, you want these because you want it to look like a Model T Ford. And they have to be in the center of the grill because that's where they are in a Model T Ford. So I took pointers from my father, and he was right. But just mounting the lights, they're up, they're down, they're out, they're in, and it could be a 2-week process before you make that decision. It's not just mount the headlight, you know? Anybody can mount the headlight. The windshield steady rods are fairly unique to this car. There were a couple in the early days that had those on. It's typical of an early Model T. They used to be leather straps to keep the windshield from blowing back. It's an accent mark on the car. In other places, we picked up the brass from Model T stuff, which other guys didn't do. I would go anywhere with this, with my son. We could still do it. We honeymooned in Florida, and we drove it from Jersey to Florida with slicks and in some pouring rain. That was 78, 79, and twice to Florida. And what a scene we caused everywhere we parked. People, this was done with the Sunkist and the Moonkist together. Both of us unmarried, dating. And it was a great feeling to be able to do this stuff. We're both mechanically inclined, Willie and myself. It wasn't any big deal. Actually, down in Florida, with the carburetors uncovered, there was a rainstorm overnight. When we woke up, it was perfectly dry out. Didn't realize it. I went to start it. It hydraulic the cylinder and broke the rings off of one piston. Now, we didn't have pistons in our pocket, so I took the spark plug out and drove it home, sounding like a freight train with one open hole in it, but it worked. Got home, pulled the piston, put new rings on it, put it back together. It was fine. When I was a kid and in my room supposed to be studying and doing homework, I was flipping through hot rods and 25-cent small rod and customs, whatever, and that was it was a passion. I said, imagine having a car good enough to be in this magazine. And not knowing it, what I had built was, you know, above and beyond my expectations. It immediately started being photographed all over and came out in so many magazines. It's in about 15 issues here and there throughout the years. It was always a showstopper until we stopped using it, and it was in other hands. But it's back on the road again, and it's going to shows. So many people remember it because of its popularity back then. It's a great feeling. It can't be replaced. Oh, this is terrific because I'm living it all over again. This is the second time for me. It was one thing to go through it. It broke my heart to sell it when we had to. The house was more important at the time, but it's still pulling on my heart. The Corvette also that I had to sell, but the Corvette I didn't fabricate. It was a beautiful piece, but when you have your heart and soul and sweat into it, and this wasn't a terribly difficult build, it just, the proportions were nice. There's so many other things that are tougher to build. It's like living life again, to see my son go through it, to enjoy it, and I'm involved with it, it's irreplaceable. It's an irreplaceable feeling.
So, my name is Randy Bianchi. I live in Englewood, New Jersey. The car we're talking about is a 23 Ford T-Bucket that was originally built by my father back in '71. He owned it from 1971 to about 1986 when he sold it. It always stayed in New Jersey, never really left. It's something that as a kid you always saw pictures of, and when you get older, you know, you always think, want something or want a cool car. And good cars really don't come for sale that often, and when they're expensive, you either got to be able to afford it or offer the guy more than what it's worth to try to get it. The car came up for sale. I had two cars that I just sold before that. I had a 40 Ford sedan and a Model 8 coupe. I sold them a couple weeks before I got a phone call seeing if I wanted to buy my dad's car. He originally wasn't on board with the idea. And when he sold it, in his eyes, it needed a lot of work to get it back to what it was, since it was a 15-year-old car at that point. And I kind of just brought it home one day, you know, that was it. And he warmed up to the idea, but you know, now it's back in the family and it's not going to leave. So this guy Stu Pear owned this car and a couple other cars that my dad built, and he was the type of guy he didn't have to sell anything, and he just, if he wanted 10 of one thing, he'd get it because he could. And he passed away, unfortunately, and I got a phone call asking if I wanted to buy it. And if that didn't go that way, I never would have been able to step up and get it, or, you know, eventually own it. My dad always had old photos of the car, probably like 30, 40, 50 photos that were always at the house. Magazines, obviously, from the early 70s up until the late 80s. You know, we had copies of all that stuff in the house, and I'd always look at it. You always want to try to find more pictures, obviously, because that's what we're into, the history and keeping track and documenting all this stuff. And I was able to find, through other people that were around the car at the time, photos and a lot of slides, actually, of the car. And one of the cars that used to run around with this car all the time was a Sunkist, another T-Bucket similar that was black with a blown big block. He passed away, Willie. I got a call from his wife saying she found a bunch of slides and albums and stuff like that in the attic when they're going through the house. I got all that stuff, and that's photos that no one's seen probably ever, because when you were taking a photo of a car that was a year old, you didn't consult photos in 1978. You weren't looking at a photo in 1979 going, oh, remember that, it was a year ago. It wasn't important, it was just a picture. And now it's become important in the, you know, the hobby, that you want to complete the timeline of any old car. The 70s stuff I always thought was cool because you could see the difference from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even the 40s. And a lot of the 70s stuff was 60s cars with a tire change or something like that. And there's still a lot of performance in the hot rods. By the time the 80s came in, it would just sucked, you know, and it was totally got changed, or they're even different cars. But a lot of the early 70s and mid 70s stuff was an updated 60s hot rod, which could have even been an updated 50s hot rod, but it still had a lot more, you know, attitude and performance in the early 70s than by the late 70s or the late 80s. And I know my car's built in the 70s, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't look like a 70s hot rod, because it doesn't have one thing that you could say, well, that's typical of a 70s car, or something typical of an 80s car. Because you look at a lot of 80s cars, they're four-door, whatever, you know, with small block and independent front suspension and, you know, tweed and all this bullshit. But that was a hot rod back then, just as well as this was a hot rod back then. So it was built in the 70s, but it doesn't necessarily look like a 70s hot rod in my eyes, because it doesn't look like a 45-year-old car today. It looks like you could have built it today, because there's nothing, like I said, holding it to 1970. To me, it looks like almost like I don't want to say a newer build, but it doesn't look dated. You know, when it's tough to say that because it's my car, but it's timeless in my eyes, you know. Also because it doesn't copy what was going on in the 70s. A lot of the 70s T-Buckets had, you know, you sat high up in them, that big windshields, high tops. Didn't fit the trend back then, which kind of makes it not dateable in my eyes, you know. Just like, you know, there's some 50s cars that don't look like 50s cars because they were ahead of all the other cars in the 50s, you know. They didn't have any funky interiors or it just looked like a timeless car. It aged well. The paint's original, the interior was done over, you know, and some of the chrome and all that stuff's been touched up. But to me, the most important thing is that it's got the original paint on it. It wasn't fucked with, or it wasn't totally changed, you know. And I had to find some stuff that was missing, and I still have some stuff that I got to put back on the car to get it back to what it was, but it's all little insignificant stuff. My dad painted the car in '71. Obviously, that's still the paint that's on it, but the pinstriping, all that stuff's original on it. It's got a airbrush sun on the back, which is kind of dates the car again, because that's when murals and all the funky, acid paint jobs were going on, and that's something you weren't doing in the 80s, and now it's kind of become maybe more mainstream with the choppers and the people trying to get back into the 60s and the 70s style cars. It's more acceptable now than it was 10 years ago to do a 70s or 60s style paint job when everyone was just trying to focus on the 50s. Because it doesn't have, like I said, it doesn't have that funky, weird thing going on with it. It kind of just all flows. Continuing the storyline of the car kind of, not that it went missing, but it wasn't really out in public for 15, 20 years when my dad sold it. And now that I got it back, I want to continue to keep it seen. And I use the car a couple times a week. I don't really go to car shows a lot because I don't have that much time, but I drive it as much as I can, and every year I like log my mileage. I just write it down on the wall in my garage, and I get the most enjoyment out of using them. So it's important to, especially with the magazine, is that keeping the timeline and the photos of going up from when it was to what it is now. And I like seeing how little it has changed. So you could almost look at a picture from 40 years ago and go, oh, it's still got that on. And to me, that's always cool, because when you find a car that's an old hot rod, all you need to do is find one thing that the guy changed, and that's what you focus on is wrong with the car, not what's right with the car. So it's always important to show both sides of how it kind of didn't change, which is what you want. So with traditional rodding culture, shooting the car, it's kind of the first time the car has been seen, featured, I'd say since the mid 80s. It had a bunch of coverage from like 71, 72 all the way up until the late 80s when my dad sold it, but it really hasn't, documented since then. And it's always been an East Coast car. My dad did drive it out to the West Coast in the early 70s. He went like a 3-month road trip with the car. So to me, it's kind of cool for the people, local people know the car, because it's been up and down the East Coast and Midwest and, all over a while ago. And I always enjoy when someone sees the car and they walk up and they remember from when they were a kid or something like that. I was at a show the other day, and I was with my dad, and a guy walks up, he goes, I don't even know why I need to look at the car. I've been looking at it since I was a kid. And to me, that's cool. I like the comments of, I haven't seen this car in a while, or do you remember when, and all that stuff. To me, that's just as important as a picture. The little stories of a guy that saw the car one time but remembers it, when they were driving down the road. Or to me, that's cool. And I like hearing that feedback. Like I said, as much as you want people, I'm not like trying to promote the car, and that's important to me, but it's, that's what you want. That's why you do this. You always want, people to see your car, and, more importantly, it's to see that it's still around. Because the guys that are reading the magazines now, if they're 50, 60, even 70 years old, if they've been in the scene for a long time, they're going to remember the car from, the 70s or the 80s, So it's kind of cool, because like I said, a lot of people, you hear a lot of, I remember the car, I haven't seen the car, where's the other one, or, do you remember when? So it's cool that you can still link it. Like we missed 20 years, but it's still here. So knowing that traditional rodding culture is doing the audio and the video on the car, and it's done not just in the States, but it's globally, it kind of, links the car back to, back into the 70s. And even guys overseas, you see online, there's pictures and people are always commenting, and, these guys could buy Hot Rod magazine back in the 70s. So it, like I said, it kind of just, the car, I don't want to say disappeared, but it was, 15 years it was on the scene pretty big, and it went away. And then, I'm never going to sell a car, and I'm just going to use the shit out of it.